Welcome to Escalation, the podcast where we dive into the front line of democratic resilience and geopolitical pressures. Today, we're joined by a particularly timely and insightful guest, Jakub Janda. Jakub is a Czech political scientist and the executive director of the European Value Center for Security Policy. Based in Prague and now also active in Taipei, Jakub has been at the forefront of efforts to counter hybrid threats from authoritarian regimes, with a sharp focus on Russian and Chinese influence operations in Europe and beyond. Jakub, it's a pleasure to have you in the podcast. I know that you consult, you explain many things that are happening in Europe to our friends in Indo-Pacific and vice versa. But in your words, where you are now and what's your main focus?
Thank you, Gabrielus, for having me. So I'm a Czech citizen. I run a think tank based out of Prague, Czech Republic. We work on foreign security policy issues, but we are the only European think tank with a permanent office in Taiwan. So we actually have two legs, you could say. One is sitting in Central Europe, working and understanding our security context here, which is quite similar to the Lithuanian positioning. And at the same time, we actually have a view sitting in Taipei, where we have an office run by other European experts working for us. And essentially what we are trying to do is to understand that if Russia would decide to for even more aggression in our region, in the Nordic, let's say northern and eastern part of NATO, how exactly can that look like? And maybe more importantly, something what is not often understood, how can China support Russia in this endeavor? In the way how China is supporting Russia against Ukraine today. So how exactly should we in Northern Central Europe be preparing for a defense against de facto axis of Russia and China at the same time? So that's kind of what I'm trying to do. I'm talking to a lot of government officials in our region in Central Europe and also in the Indo-Pacific with like-minded countries with whom we work with, which is mainly Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and Australia.
Well, thank you, Jakub. Indeed, it's very close to what I thought that we would talk about today. But again, it is quite interesting and unique that out of the Central and Eastern European countries, there are not so many countries that would have an Indo-Pacific focused think tank. And when you think about the policies of the countries, Czechia stands out as a country who clearly had and has an Indo-Pacific direction and strategy. Could you run us through, why did it happen? Is it, historic, and where it is currently?
Yep. Essentially, Czech Republic has been a target of Chinese elite capture. The same way how Baltic nations and other countries in our region have been, roughly since 2015. So essentially, the Chinese state came to our region pretty much trying to bribe everybody economically, politically, to be closer to Chinese Communist Party. That happened. In the Czech Republic, it was quite successful for some time. We had the previous Czech president was very close and very much aligned with Chinese Communist Party, the same way how people in our previous governments were. But it actually hit the rock. So there has been a lot of pushback in the Czech politics by the Czech national security establishment. We had a lot of domestic political fights over cybersecurity, telecommunications, like the 5G discussion, but also to issues related to Taiwan. So in roughly 2018 and 19, this was a combination where Czech national security establishment, some of the Czech think tanks, including my own, but others as well, and back then the center-right opposition parties actually started to say, look, we are not allies of communist China. We better stand up and actually obviously be the allies of the United States and other European friends. But also, let's really see what we could do together with Taiwan. So that's where actually the engagement during that time, mainly from opposition parties in the Czech politics, actually started to do with Taiwan. The Speaker of the Czech Senate visited Taiwan in 2020, and there were others following in this path. And then in 2021, the previous government, let's say center-left government, lost the Czech elections. And then the new government, center-right five-party coalition, actually entered the government here in Prague. And they essentially said, look, we are changing the course. We are not going to be friends and cuddling up, let's say, with the Chinese Communist Party. We are going to do the right things. We are going to engage with Taiwan in some specific areas. And we are going to engage with others like Japan and Korea mainly for us on some economic and political projects.
And, probably we need to mention the president, the current president of Czech Republic. And, he took some brave steps, reaching out to Taiwan, meeting and calling. I mean, that has been seen, right? So it's also his personal agenda, I would say.
No, absolutely. The Czech president, commander-in-chief, he's a former general. He's the former chairman of NATO military committee, so like a four-star general. He's really, really good. And so what he did is that he had phone calls with President Tsai, president of Taiwan. He also welcomed her after she finished her term. So he hosted her in Prague last fall. But also he did something what is quite unprecedented in diplomatic history. And my think tank was part of it. So in June 2023, it was the first time ever that there would be a NATO head of state in a public meeting, in a public event with the active Taiwanese foreign minister. So we hosted that in Prague. There was expectation whether China will push very hard against that, but there was no real punishment outside of the usual shouting of Chinese ambassador. And these kind of things actually start happening. Some of them are happening publicly, some privately, because the effort is, and it's similar what you have been doing as a foreign minister of Lithuania, is trying to move the needle, move the norm, what is acceptable to do with Taiwan. And I think collectively, with your support and others here in Prague as well, a lot of things has moved forward, essentially to show to other European allies and friends, look, we could do these things with Taiwan, and China will not destroy us. And I think that's quite positive there.
So I think what you're saying is that we've been witnessing China moving the red lines. What they deem possible for others to do, but Czechia and well, in Lithuania, in some cases, we push the red lines back. But in Czechia's case, you have not seen major repercussions from the Chinese reaction or something like that.
Yes, there has not been the kind of political and partly economic pressure in the same way how Lithuania has faced that. One of the key reasons is that actually Czech Republic is, I would say, quite well understood by China as de facto part of German federal economy. And at the same time, we know how China invests in political relations with Germany, regardless of who is in power. And China doesn't want to upset this relationship between China and Germany because essentially Czech Republic is, not only the neighbor, but part of the Czech economy is part of a Bavarian economy, for example, which is very significant in German politics. So this is one of the reasons, not the main one, but one of the reasons why China is shouting, but doesn't really bite on the Czech side.
Okay, I see. Look, one question that is connected to what we're talking about, but I understand that there is an election coming up in Czechia. Maybe you could offer a brief rundown as to how you see the situation developing. Can we expect that the current government could continue working in some form?
I think the general expectation is that the current center-right coalition of currently 4 political parties in Czech politics, they are likely going to lose the next elections. That's what the polls are saying. And they have been doing very strong messaging and real activities in support of Ukraine. So geopolitically, very good government. In domestic politics, they have taken a lot of beating for social economic reasons. Plus, the current main opposition party, which is a center-left populist party run by one of the Czech oligarchs. His name is Andrej Babiš. He's the former Czech prime minister till 2021. So he's most likely going to win the elections. And the question is with whom he will form the coalition, because we have a proportionate electoral system, which means that usually you need one large party and 1 or 2 smaller parties to form a coalition to have a majority in the chamber of deputies. So this is the most likely outcome.
What would it mean for the geopolitical stance? How far it would shift?
Yeah, the expectation, it really depends on who will be the junior coalition partners, whether some of them would be some of the far-right parties, which is possible. I don't think it's likely, but it's possible. Then it would really be a lot of compromises on foreign policy issues. In general, there is a very strong national security and national defense establishment here in Prague, which is, I would say, honestly, very, very hawkish. It's very much aligned with where Lithuanian counterparts are in the military, in the intelligence community, in police community. All of them are very well aligned. So essentially, that's where the sitting is. Plus, the current Czech president is very hawkish on Russia, on China. So that's the positive part. Plus, we have a second chamber called the Senate here, which is absolutely hawkish. They are the closest friends of Taiwan, but from anywhere, sometimes even tougher than some of our American friends, so which is really good. But there might be some changes on the executive branch level. Essentially, the expectation is that the next government might be less vocal. So the talk about human rights issues, normative issues might be less vocal, I would expect. But when it comes to real geopolitical setting, I don't think there are gonna be major changes. Also, one of the reasons is that nobody here in Prague really wants to even make the relationship with the United States even more toxic, because it is already pretty dynamic. And I think the understanding there is we really do not want to hasten any possible US downsizing or even withdrawal from our region. So essentially, for one of these reasons, the next government might be, let's say, less vocal in support of Taiwan, for example, but the governmental structures and all of that, and the policies will most likely remain very similar, but the rhetorics will likely be downsized. That's at least my expectation.
Jakub, what you're saying is basically that the policies towards China and Taiwan would not be changed, not to antagonize the United States, right? Do I understand correctly?
To some extent, yes. I think to some extent, yes. Plus, the other reason is that there are some actually quite good economic projects between Czech Republic and Taiwan. So I don't think there will be any effort to really damage this. There are even let's say Taiwanese diplomats already are talking to the opposition party here in Prague. And my understanding is that there is some good agreement on essentially economic diplomacy issues, all of the kind of more general, less sensitive issues which are going on, because one of the reasons is that as TSMC is building the semiconductor factory in Dresden in Germany, it's quite close to Czech borders. So part of the supply chain of Taiwanese companies which are coming with TSMC to Europe will be or are setting up their European branches in Prague. So that's good. And nobody really wants to damage this because economically that makes sense.
Okay.
So likely much of the Czech relations with Taiwan will be essentially going under the umbrella of semiconductor cooperation, maybe something on drones, on UAVs. So that's essentially the economic cooperation part, let's say. And in foreign policy, I think much of it will stay the same because it's quite well understood. And I think something what you have seen in Lithuania as well is that actually if you are a good friend of Taiwan, as a relatively small country from Europe, it opens a lot of doors in Washington. So for example, Czech embassy in Washington is actually getting a lot of support by TECRO, by the Taiwanese de facto embassy in DC, which is actually very powerful and very important for us in the current setting where it's quite difficult to discuss some issues with the US administration. My understanding is that this is one of the reasons where it makes sense to be a good friend of Taiwan, also very pragmatically speaking.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. Look, Jakub, if you agree, then let's switch to Indo-Pacific, where your I would say main focus has been, and clearly that the changes, the geopolitical changes that we've seen, not just from the start of full-scale Russian invasion on Ukraine, but also the recent changes when it comes to U.S. posturing in Europe and the whole geopolitical dynamics that coming out of it. I would like to focus on that a little bit now throughout the conversation. One particular point is that that there are assumptions and people are thinking that one of the reasonable explanations as to what the US government is trying to achieve is what it's called the reverse Kissinger, the attempt to split China and Russia by wooing Russia closer to United States. And you've been working with the region for a very long time. You know Russia, you know China. Your assessment is that achievable? Is that doable?
No, absolutely not. That's the short answer. I mean, it could have been possible 15 years ago. And honestly, that's to some extent what the Obama administration tried. And essentially what they did, they basically said, look, Russia, we are essentially withdrawing from Central Eastern Europe. We are not going to be the threatening power to you there. So please behave so that we could really work on China. That was basically the Obama administration's effort. It failed miserably. One of the reasons of the Russian war to Ukraine is that Russia understood it as a weakness and an open door for their attack. So it completely failed. But that's 15, 20 years ago almost. Where we are now is essentially Russia and China are working very, very closely together. Much of the Russian economy is dependent on China. Much of the Russian elite is dependent on China currently, because after 2022, after the large war Russia started, China has been the only source of, let's say, technology, supplies, money, bribes, all of that, and political support on a strategic level. So essentially, without Chinese support, Russia would be unable of continuing the war against Ukraine on such a scale. And essentially, much of the regime security inside Russia would be very uncertain, let's say. So for that reason, if you would like to grab Russia out of the Chinese hands, I'm honestly just thinking, what do you need to offer to the Russian elite? Which means the FSB elite, which means some of the oligarchs, which means Putin and his closest circle. So what is he getting out of China, outside of, let's say, money, political support, and so on? That's basically survival strategy for him. Currently with China, he knows China cannot really drop him regardless of what he does. So in that sense, he's relatively safe in his mind. So if you are the United States or anybody else, what can you offer to Russia for this? And honestly, my answer would be, well, if you can offer half of Europe, then okay, Russia might consider that. But it's impossible. Even if the United States would like to do it, and I don't think they would, but even if they would try, it's impossible. Because countries in our region, Lithuania, Poland, all of us here, nobody will really submit to whatever big deal would there be. We cannot do it based on our history, right? So to some extent, the United States can, let's say, sell the whole issue of Ukraine to Russia. That's that's very possible, unfortunately. But that's pretty much it. That's where we are. So again, what's the logic for the Russian leadership? Well, if the Americans cannot give us much. I mean, Russia definitely wants the sanctions to be lifted because that really hurts to the Russian interests, or the oligarchic interests at least in Russia. So that's what they want. But what can we offer so that it's better than the Chinese deal for them? And honestly, I don't see anything else.
How do you think that China is taking it? I mean, they've been silent about this.
Mhm.
They were not part of this conversation, right?
Mhm.
It's mostly Russian Western conversation, but they are part of this equation. Clearly, they have analysts who are thinking about this. What do you think goes through their mind?
My understanding is that for China, they are not afraid that Russia would betray them. For one simple, on a strategic level, like really at the level of Putin and his leadership, because they see the calculation themselves. They know what China is giving to Russia. They know how the Russian regime is de facto dependent on Chinese support. So I don't think they are really scared of this. I think they're quite happy about the disruptions this all causes to the Europe-US alliance as well. They're very happy about that, because they really want to decouple US and Europe. In that sense, they want to isolate the United States, and essentially making the relationship between US and Europe bad or toxic is exactly what both Russia and China want. At the same time, I would say that China really wants Russia to, let's say, not only survive, but essentially get better, because they need Russia to be relatively strong, so that there is a reason why, for example, some of the US military assets would need to stay in Europe because of the Russian threat. Because in the Chinese mind, you want to split the US resources. You want some of the US military resources, mainly the Navy and Air Force, to have to be able to be partly in Europe and partly in the Middle East, so that these US military assets are not deployable in East Asia against China in the main theater of operations for them. This is what you want if you are China, which means that you need Russia to be relatively strong, or Russia to be still threatening or even fighting physically in Europe, as they are doing now. That's exactly what you want, because also it squeezes resources in Europe and the US, and, for example, creates a lot of these bad dilemmas, which is, if you are the US government, regardless of which politician runs you now, but you have to make very tough decisions over resources, not only military assets like troops and technologies, but, for example, ammunitions, or essentially like air defense programs, for example. And the question is, am I going to put 100% of all of my assets into Taiwan and the territory, or to Ukraine and the Baltic states, for example? And those are zero-sum games, unfortunately, just material speaking. So that's exactly what, if you are China, you want to create these bad dilemmas for the US, so that there is this effort. So China doesn't want the US to leave Europe as a military force. Obviously, Russia wants that, but China does not really, because China wants some of the US military to stay in Europe.
Jakub, we're witnessing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, we are witnessing a couple of new or newer developments now when it comes to China. One of them is the heightened assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific region. One of them, just an example, like circumventing Australia, or now cable cuttings around Taiwan, and exercise, and kind of there's a lot of activity, and it's military activity that we have not seen previously. So that's one part. The second part is, what you could call this. Again, that they're trying to reapproach the European countries. I know that they have been, the Chinese were proposing meetings to European leaders that have not happened, for years, in the past, and now suddenly they start picking up the phone, and kind of making conversations, engaging in the conversation, and so on and so forth. What to make of it? What is their interest then in Europe and in Indo-Pacific currently? Where do you think they are?
So there are two angles to this. One is, what is China doing towards Europe? I mean, China wants to increase the wedge, the differences between Europeans and the Americans. China wants Europe to stay as a Chinese economic and political market. China really needs access to what I would call the wider German supply chain, which is Germany itself and countries which are de facto part of German economy, which is, I mean, Czech Republic, Netherlands, Denmark, partly the Baltic nations as well. We all are in that sense. Economically, it makes sense to us. But this is exactly what China wants. They need to keep access. I mean, for commercial, but also economic security reasons, because essentially it is very important for domestic economic stability in China. So China needs this to continue. So what they need is essentially to hug any European politician who they can, so they could kind of bribe us politically, sometimes even financially. That's what they are doing. Because at the same time, they are, in the trade sense, they are not acting as friends or allies at all. They are very hostile to our companies as well. I mean, to most of the European businesses. Yeah. So that's something what they need to overplay this de facto hostility which China is creating already, or at least just on the trade side. If we just exclude all the security matters, just trade-wise, China is very hostile to Europe. So the only choice they have is essentially to do this political cover, and those are all these lovely meetings with whoever European leader comes to Beijing and de facto kneels to the Chinese dictator. There is a competition among European leaders, unfortunately, who is going to do it more, and who is going to get more of kind of contracts for their own national companies. And that's pretty horrifying, I have to say. The second question is what is China doing towards the Indo-Pacific? And essentially, that's divide and conquer. So essentially, what China is doing is trying to isolate the core US allies, such as Taiwan, Japan, partly Korea as well, threaten others, because I mean, something what honestly I think we as Europeans might have hard time understanding in the Indo-Pacific, because, in our region, North and Central Europe, we are quite used to being allies in recent decades, which, I mean, very practically, like, for example, defense of Lithuania, much of it is about the German brigade, for example. And just imagine, this is unthinkable anywhere in Asia. And I have to say, I was just, for example, in some of the closed-door discussions in Korea, and they were like, well, what can we do outside of the US alliance? And I'm like, well, if I would use a European example for you, it would be a Japanese brigade guarding Seoul, your capital, against the North Koreans. This would be the equivalent of
what is the
German
reaction?
brigade in Lithuania, right? To some extent. So that's something what obviously is politically undoable in the Korean context, or the other way around, like Koreans defending Japan. But this is what the alliance is. It's not only the US, but also the kind of small allies helping each other, or mid-sized allies. And this is unthinkable. This is undoable at all, and anywhere in Asia among the most like-minded countries. So that's why it's so important for China, what China is doing. And China is essentially telling each of them, like, you have no chance. Like, you need to basically give up and become part of Chinese economic orbit, or stop resisting economically or even militarily to us, because you have no chance. You have no real alliance. You only hope the Americans are coming, and that's the only thing you have. And it's to some extent true for many of the Asian democratic countries.
Jakub, you've heard that, I think, number of times, and when people are saying that Chinese strategy spans thousands of years, and so for them to shift the direction of the ship is always impossible or very difficult to do that in relation to something that is happening fast. But recent events, the ones that you talked about in Europe, approaching the leaders, and also in Indo-Pacific, frightening some of them and alienating others. Do you think that's also related to what is happening in Washington, or comes out of Washington? Is it a reaction, or is it kind of a broader strategy that started, 20 years ago, and it should end by, 2048?
I think the Chinese strategy in this sense is really long term, and they only make some adjustments based on current reality, let's say. The current reality is that basically the relationship between the US leadership and basically any US ally in the world almost is very fragile now, and it's very, very much part of renegotiating of whatever balance there might be between US and Europe and US and Indo-Pacific allies. So this is a fragile time. And so essentially what China does is that China essentially speeds up or upgrades its, I would say, basically pressure. Sometimes it doesn't look like pressure, but essentially it is pressure. Because something what is maybe not so understandable in Europe is that the cost of being an American ally in Asia is actually very high, which means that if you are a US ally, economically, you are missing out on a lot of economic opportunities as a country, essentially. So you are a US US ally only if you have to be one, which is like, Japan, Australia, Taiwan, countries which have their backs against the wall, essentially, militarily speaking, strategically speaking. So they have to be US allies. And I mean, it's about what you do practically, but this is kind of where they are. But there are countries who can basically shift, or who can basically say, look, okay, does it make sense to be part of the US defense alliance? Honestly, we don't want to put all of our money in defense, and we want to make sure that when there is a conflict, we are not going to be in the middle of it. And that's most of the ASEAN countries. That's maybe Korea in the future as well, South Korea, I mean. So that's exactly where those tough decisions are, and China knows that. So they are increasing the economic cost for being a U.S. ally. And I really hope that the new U.S. presidential administration understands well. I mean, they have the information about it, but that it will inform their strategic decisions, because it's quite fragile. We might be in a situation in a couple of years where, for example, South Korea would formally be a U.S. ally, but in practice, their alignment with China economically might be deeper and deeper, because they might not see as a choice to kind of resist the Chinese economic offers. Yeah.
Well, Jakub, that connects to my next question. I'm sure that what is happening in Europe and the way that the transatlantic conversation is going on, that is being calculated in Indo-Pacific. So if Europe is now in the stage of trying to figure out, how reliable United States is as a partner guaranteeing Article 5, so I'm sure that these conversations and thinking is going on in Indo-Pacific countries like, you've mentioned Japan and South Korea, take Philippines and Australia. Have you heard, and throughout your conversations and through your experience, what are people thinking?
There are two layers to this. One is US-Ukraine or US-Russia-Ukraine. Second is US-NATO. Because I think at least the establishments, the leaderships in the Pacific countries, they understand that there are differences between those two agendas, even though they're interlinked, but there are some differences. So on the Russia-Ukraine negotiation, I would say anybody I have talked to in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Australia, everybody's very scared, because they're like, look, if Ukraine would be thrown under the bus by the Americans, that's not only horrible for Ukraine, but it's horrible for all of us, because it basically means Russia, China, North Korea will understand that they can eat up small countries and there will be no punishment for the aggressor, which is kind of the 1937, 1938 moment for many of them, like the Spanish Civil War moment kind of style. And they're like, well, then it's really, really bad, because you cannot go back from such a decision or momentum, for example. That's why you see a lot of support, which is not so obvious, honestly, from countries like Japan or even South Korea or Australia and Taiwan in support of Ukraine. I mean, the amounts which they are sending over, at least in humanitarian aid, sometimes in even some military technologies, that's actually quite big. And they don't have to do it. They're like, well, it's far away. And honestly, they barely know where Ukraine is. But in a sense, they understand the logic why they need to be doing it. So that's still happening, but unclear where it goes based on President Trump's decisions. The second basket is even more serious for them, which is basically where the United States have treaty commitments, how the US Congress calls that, to Europeans through NATO. I mean, they are really, I would say, these Indo-Pacific allies, they clearly see how US administration is pressuring Europeans on defense spending and so on. And they're like, okay, Europeans are first on the plate. For Europeans will first get pressure to really commit to these 3, 4, 5% GDP defense spending and so on. So we'll watch and adjust our strategies. What they do, these Indo-Pacific countries, specifically Japan, Taiwan, Korea, they are committing to quite major civilian investment inside the United States. So they're essentially coming to President Trump saying, we understand this is basically the tax for being your ally and you are protecting us. So here is where we are basically giving you back, which is our investment in inside of your country, creating jobs for Americans and so on. This is basically what's happening. There is already huge investments of Europeans in the US, so it's really hard to do something like that on the European side. But this is at least what those Indo-Pacific allies are doing.
Okay, and again, if we connect this question more specifically to Taiwan, your experiences, how much are Ukrainian lessons being taken in Taiwan? How closely they are watching it?
Absolutely closely. I have to say this is the first question any Taiwanese defense security intelligence official asks any of us coming from Europe. Because, I mean, very practically, there are specific things which Taiwan already adopts from the Ukraine example. One is How do you keep your cities operational when there is a war? That's a big lesson where Ukrainians are doing it very well, and Taiwan needs to prepare for it. Second is, if you are a de facto small player and you have a huge navy against you, which to some extent is the Black Sea situation or has been before for Ukraine, how do you defend yourself in this denial strategy? Because Ukraine has been very successful in basically kicking out the Russian navy out of the Black Sea, and that's exactly a very practical lesson for the Taiwanese defenders. So they have been taking a lot of lessons there. The third thing, very practically, is the undersea cables, because we all see how Russia and to some extent China is doing it in the Baltic Sea or in the whole Nordic Baltic region. And obviously, this is something what China is already doing around Taiwan, or preparing to cut out the cables or even shoot out the satellites during the hot phase, so that there would be blackouts inside Taiwan, which would be the interest for China to do that. So these things are very much happening. The last thing I would mention, and that's very sensitive, is that how do you prepare your population before the crisis starts, before the war starts? Because that's politically the toughest question. Because in basically any country, you would have opposition parties saying, well, we shouldn't be preparing so much. We should not be so aggressively defensive, let's say. And in most countries, you can hear that. And in Taiwan as well. So they are kind of using Ukraine as an example of how Taiwan needs to prepare in civil defense terms, like domestically, how to harden itself, not only the military, but mainly the civilian institutions and organizations. So there's a lot of this, plus Taiwan is actually quite a good donor inside Ukraine. They are funding a lot of like health and civilian issues inside Ukraine to help them. But it's obviously very hard because Ukraine is in a very tough spot currently, so we cannot really engage with Taiwan. It would likely give much more excuses for China to even support Russia more. So it's very hard how to engage on the diplomatic or political level. But on the security or practical issues, there is a lot of engagement between Ukraine and Taiwan.
Yeah, when I visited Taiwan, I got the sense, at least from my conversations, that I'm not sure whether that's possible to compare this, but in some ways it was compared to the atmosphere that we in the Eastern Flank had in 2014. When Russia attacked Ukraine for the first time, there was a war in Crimea, part of the Eastern territories were under occupation. So there was nervousness, but it wasn't like, the countries were under full preparation. So I got the sense that, when it comes to the population, Taiwan is somewhere Europe in 2014, not Europe in 2022. Is it also your experience?
I would agree. I think it's a fair assessment, fair comparison. Even though in last roughly half a year, it's actually really boosting in Taiwan.
Okay.
There's a lot of sprinting, partly also because of President Trump's inauguration and his activities, but also because the Chinese aggressive activities at sea and in hybrid domain and others, it's actually, I would call it pre-war period. So essentially, it's not just doesn't mean that the war starts tomorrow, but it means that China is actively preparing to be able to do the full blockade of Taiwan. Essentially, if they decide for tomorrow, China can start the full blockade of Taiwan tomorrow. It will have tough time for the amphibious invasion because they are just material-wise, Chinese military is not ready yet. They are still missing some segments and capacities for basically the invasion overseas. So that's much harder. But when it comes to naval and air blockade of Taiwan, China is pretty much ready to do that tomorrow if they decide for it. So doesn't mean they will, but it's very, very possible they will start doing like short-term quarantines, like for a week or 10 days before there is a hard reaction by the United States, just to squeeze Taiwan, economically, but also politically, so people will be really considering whether it makes sense to resist because the fears of being left alone. I think us sitting in Europe, we really cannot really understand it well because we are not an island. We are in a sense, but we have land borders with each other pretty much in Europe, outside of the UK. But for Taiwan, if you are sitting in an island and your only option is basically the closest neighbor is the big China, which wants to attack you, and the island logic is a bad situation. I would basically the only example. There are two examples from like last century at least where small islands survive these kind of blockade or pressure campaigns. One is the United Kingdom in World War II, the German blockade during that time, and they studied very deeply. The second one, which is much smaller, is the German and Italian blockade of Malta, which almost nobody knows about, but this is an example of good survival in that kind of context back then. But today it's much different because of the economics is very different.
Look, and with this, I want you to, if you can, expand a little bit on the scenarios? Like, I think that this is main part of your work, to to analyze and to plan, or to help others plan. So, the scenario, the most likely, scenario that you would see for the upcoming, or two upcoming years for Taiwan, for Indo-Pacific, with the facts that we currently know. What is your assessment?
There are essentially two major options for China if China wants to really attack. I mean, China can keep boiling the frog as we are now, the economic warfare and hybrid low intensity campaign as today, they can continue. But if Chinese government decides for action, they have essentially two main options. First is essentially what we call slow buildup of a blockade. So China would start pressuring individual businesses from the supply chains at sea, I mean, in Taiwan, towards Europe as well. There would be a de facto blockade of Chinese Navy around Taiwan, similar to 1962 American blockade of Cuba, which was called a quarantine for legal reasons, but essentially it was a blockade, which is something what exactly China can do around Taiwan. And it would take multiple weeks as they would develop it, because there is a timeline for Taiwan. Taiwan is very dependent on imports of different goods, including energy products from the Middle East. So essentially, once this starts being disrupted, the time starts ticking for Taiwan. Taiwan only has, let's say, roughly 1 month, maybe 2 months of being able to survive internally when there is external isolation, de facto full blockade. So that's one of the options. China would go for this if they decide that they cannot make any deal with the US, and this is the right time for them to basically squeeze Taiwan and force it into a political capitulation, if China would be sure that the United States would not send a navy to break the blockade. So that's option number one. Option number two is the full invasion, which is possible, but then the Chinese option is to make it as quick as possible, because the limited time for any major reaction. China would be playing for time if they decide for full invasion. The disadvantage for China is that it would actually take at least 3 to 4 months of their full preparations at the Fujian province, basically at the Chinese coast as well. So it would be known to basically everybody that China is preparing for a possible invasion, similar to December 2021 around Ukraine, or January 22, for example. We also Russia was getting ready. We maybe did not know when exactly and how, but it was clear they are really getting ready for the real full-scale invasion. So this is the Chinese option. My personal estimate is that China will actually go for the blockade option, not fully. They might really do short-term blockades for 7 to 10 days to squeeze the international business around, or international shipping lane, to show to everybody, to Taiwan itself, but also regional friends of Taiwan, that China can actually do it very effectively, and they have no chance of really defending themselves if China goes. And that would be part of the Chinese de facto negotiation with President Trump, basically telling him, we can take Taiwan just with the blockade. And for you, United States, you would have a lot of difficult decisions, which would cost you a lot. So you better think twice before you really keep defending Taiwan, for example. So I think those are the two options.
And Jakub, well, it's definitely scary, and I'm not sure whether you've seen this, but quite recently, it's due to the increased tension between the trade tension between the U.S. and China. Now, President Trump is actually asking for talks to be open between Beijing and Washington. And as far as I read, that the President Xi returned saying that if Washington wants to have conversation about the tariffs, they have to be prepared to talk about Taiwan as well. So, I mean, how worried should we be? I mean, is it the first the first shots in that direction, as you're saying?
Mm-hmm. No, it's part of the long-term Chinese negotiation strategy. Anything you talk them with about, they always involve the Taiwan question, as they call it, in a similar way how basically Russia involves pretty much eastern flank of NATO in any discussion about Ukraine currently with the US, because this is their long-term goal. They are not only on Taiwan. In the case of China, it's really about the East Asia security infrastructure, because basically Taiwan is only one, even though it's a key prize, but it's only one of the largest piece of the puzzle. So in that sense, China is trying to negotiate several baskets with President Trump over that. China has a lot of kind of squeeze the candies which they can give to Trump. Could be like pressuring North Korea on the ICBM program, could be like scaling down some of the fentanyl issues which Chinese government is de facto running. So those are the small things kind of which China can deliver to President Trump and see if he is willing to negotiate over some of these items. I don't think he really can actually sell out Taiwan. That's the usual question people have over like, can the United States sell out Taiwan? I would say honestly for two reasons that they cannot, regardless of whoever the president is. First, because if they do, the US dependence on Taiwanese most advanced semiconductors is actually huge. And those are the parts of the US industry, like the space industry, defense industry, or part of the electronics industry in the US. They are existentially dependent on basically the supply chain from Taiwan. Those most advanced semiconductors, which are not being built anywhere else, not in Arizona, not in Japan, not in Europe. So that's number one. That's why the US must defend Taiwan if they don't want their own economy to really be collapsing. Second reason is that if US would actually sell out Taiwan in some way, then the whole US coalition in the Pacific would de facto collapse. In that sense, Taiwan is the Western Berlin of this century, because like you give it up, and just looking at the map, there is no reason for the Philippines to stay in the US coalition, because essentially even militarily doesn't make sense. And then the US would be basically left only with Japan and Australia, who basically have to be US allies because they have no other choice. But most likely US would lose Korea as an ally if this happens. And that's what basically everybody working in this field knows. So for that reason, selling out Taiwan is essentially killing the whole domino effect, starting the whole domino effect for the US. So, and I think most people around President Trump understand it very well, actually.
Well, with the second argument, I fully agree with you. The first argument is I've sat through conversations in Europe where similar arguments were placed and were talked about. Some of the interlocutors in Europe would say China, if it takes over Taiwan, it would be able to run the TSMC factory as efficiently as Taiwanese can. I mean, I know it sounds
Yes.
cynical, but I mean, but there are people who think like this, and I'm pretty sure that China can make this argument to either Americans or Europeans. What do you think?
No, absolutely. This is the Chinese argument saying, just give us Taiwan, we will give you even more. This is their selling argument. I think it's easy to say, okay, we can go for it, but I think it would be strategically very stupid. Plus, basically, if you are a US president, are you willing to put a stability of the whole or much of the US economy on a promise of the Chinese Communist Party that they will
Absolutely.
You know, it's like trusting Hitler in 38, right? Like,
Yeah.
not about the war itself, but just like, okay, I'm just going to grab this and I'm going to be your friend after that.
Yeah. No,
Well,
I fully agree with you.
That's basically, I think, why it makes no real sense to really rely on that, because those are not just decisions about Taiwan, but just domestically speaking in the United States, it's about the future of specific sectors of industry.
Yeah.
Because I'm still amazed by the scope of how dependent they are on Taiwan. Honestly, I am. But that's the factual reality, and those businesses know that. So they are now silent. But if President Trump would be moving towards any kind of sellout on Taiwan, I'm quite sure they would be very much coming back to the US Republicans that telling them, guys, you cannot kill us by doing it. You would kill us by doing it. So please don't do it.
Okay. Jakub, my last question, and thank you for generosity, for your generosity with time. If you were to give an advice now to European leaders from Spain to Finland, from Eastern flank to Western Europe, as to how to approach Indo-Pacific, what to do now, what is the strategically prudent advice, strategy that you would advise to follow?
I think our best, and I would honestly call it survival strategy for countries, at least in North and Central Europe, what we need to be doing, and I know you study in Lithuania, and I'm pushing the same thing here in Prague with many other friends, we need to team up and align with the core US ally in the Indo-Pacific, with the allies, with Taiwan itself mainly, but Japan, Korea, Philippines, Australia, maybe a couple of others. And there is a very practical reason for that. Not only, I mean, they are good economic partners, that's good, but more importantly, our main enemies, Russia, China, and North Korea, are an alliance. They are an axis working against us. It's happening already, and it's going deeper and deeper. And we are not going to change that. So we have basically two options. Either we as Europeans pretend that it's not our fight, and this global alliance of dictatorship is not going to attack us, which we all know it might, unfortunately, through Russia. That's why I would call it a stupid decision if we go in this direction. But many European leaders are thinking in this direction, say like, we only care about Europe, blah, blah, blah. China is not our problem, it's partner, and so on. But it makes no sense. And I spent a couple of years persuading people in our wider Central European region saying, we need to care about China. Not that I'm not saying stop caring about Russia threat, not at all. I'm saying it's the same thing. Because, for example, now when we are having private conversations with people in defense ministry, general staff of wider Central Europe, now they start understanding that if we are defending ourselves from the Russian military attack in the future, China will be assisting Russia in economically, technologically, influence-wise. And that's why we need to align with those who are on our side. And it's obviously the Americans, but smaller players who we can reach, those are the Taiwanese and a couple of others. For practical reasons, but also for the reason to be able to tell our American friends, this is one global theater, and we are really on two sides of it, like, Eastern Europe, Eastern Asia, kind of. But basically, it's the same thing, because if you give up on Eastern Europe, it's gonna hurt you so badly, you Americans and us, because we live here. So, yeah. I mean, for that reason, I think it makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, Jakub, thank you so much. That was a very interesting conversation. Thank you for your time, and I wish you all the best in your work and in your fight. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, Gabrielus. Great to be with you.
Thank you so much for joining. I hope that it was as interesting to you as it was to me. And subscribe for other conversations that are coming in the future. And stay tuned.